Well, hello everyone here in the room and virtually joining us. Welcome. My name's Laura Mastretta, and we're here tonight with Rights and Democracy Vermont to talk about energy democracy. But we're going to have a pretty awesome speaker join us via Zoom from about 7 to 7:30 with time for questions from the audience, whether you are virtual or in person. There will be an ability to ask questions. But just to start off, I wanted to give some context as to why we're talking about energy democracy tonight, and just sort of set the stage for why we put this event together. And before that, happy to tell you a little bit about who am I, why the heck am I at the front of this room here. But basically, the gist is that I grew up in New York City, so I'm a transplant to Vermont. I got really activated to be engaged in environmental organizing after studying abroad in Costa Rica and actually seeing like how freaking beautiful the planet is after growing up in such a built environment, and learning about climate change and studying environmental science policy in school really honestly freaked me out and activated me to get involved. And so I've been working in environmental activism and organizing for I guess like 5 years now, which sounds like a lot, but really isn't that much. But the most critical piece to say recently is that I came to Vermont as an organizer and worked for VPIRG for about 9 months on a campaign to pass a tax on carbon pollution, and organized in all different parts of the state. I was organizing in central Vermont, in the Northeast Kingdom, down in Brattleboro. So I talked to a lot of different people in a lot of different parts of Vermont about energy issues. And one thing that I noticed and realized that surprised me as a flatlander coming into this beautiful green state, known for progressive issues, known to be environmentally friendly, is that the conversation around energy is there is one. It's not, renewable energy here in Vermont is a contested issue. Not necessarily the existence of renewable energy, but the way in which we're citing renewable energy, the way in which we're determining who owns the energy, the way in which we're determining how, what say communities have in our energy, is a really hot issue, which I think especially here in Burlington we don't really see, but is something that is really flames up in these towns throughout Vermont that are, where big energy companies come to them and ask them to place, whether it's large-scale solar, large-scale wind kind of projects, there's a debate happening. And I think it's a debate that unfortunately gets really nasty publicly, and oftentimes folks who have legitimate reasons to be wary of corporate-owned large-scale projects can be painted as anti-environment. Folks who are pushing these projects because they feel really passionately about reaching 90% renewable energy by 2050, which is our state's goal, get painted as corporate lobbyists. And it's just not a very productive conversation right now. And so really, after seeing kind of firsthand and like sitting down with some of the biggest anti-wind activists in the Northeast Kingdom, I just personally, and after also talking to other people, realized other people felt this way too, that there's got to be a different way. And this is a conversation that's already been started in Vermont with, Act 174, Austin, the renewable energy siting bill. There was already huge discussion in the State House about how do we incorporate more community voice into the siting of renewable energy projects, but also balance that against our need to get off fossil fuels, which is clearly a necessity. And so this had heard of this concept of energy democracy and was talking to people, and basically was starting to come, we're here tonight to learn more about energy democracy, so I'm not here to talk about it because I don't know that much about it. That's why we're having this event. But basically the idea is that, right now we've got an energy system that is determined by powerful interests in terms of where our energy comes from, where our energy is sited, where the profits from that energy go, where the energy itself goes, and especially in a state like Vermont where we've never had to look at where our energy comes from, having these projects come into our state can be pretty alarming for some folks, and they can feel like, it needs that they feel a need to have input, which is reasonable and democratic. And so we're here to talk about a system that not only seeks to still achieve renewable energy and a renewable future, but also, include participation from people, in the process of the energy siting and whatnot, but also the process of owning the energy and profiting from the energy and distributing the energy. In a process that disrupts the status quo and isn't just us unplugging from a natural gas plant and replugging into a solar array, but actually redistributes the power within the energy system to include our communities and people. So I think I'm going to stop there, and I think Timothy should be joining us quite soon, though I stopped a little short of what I thought I was going to say. That's okay. But basically, I can introduce our speaker really quickly, but he'll be joining us any second now. But really exciting to have Timothy DenHerder-Thomas join us. He is going to be talking to us from Minnesota. He is the general manager of Cooperative Energy Futures and is a board member for Community Power. And the way this is going to work is that Timothy has a brief presentation he's put together for us. That's basically, we asked him to cover, what is the problem? What does our current energy system look like? Why is there a need to change things? Then why is energy democracy the answer to the problem? And then really talk about what are some concrete ways in which we can fight for energy democracy? What are some concrete ways in which energy democracy is already happening in parts of the country? And so that will take about 15 to 20 minutes is his presentation, and there will be 15 minutes for questions. Like I said, whether you're here live or online, there will be a way for you to ask questions. So we definitely want to encourage that. And then for those who are here in Burlington with us in person and vivo, we'll continue the discussion post Timothy, and we can talk a little bit more. We'd love to hear your thoughts about this whole thing and what you think any questions you'll have further, or how we can bring this to other people here in Vermont, and also get a little hyped for the People's Climate Rally. Make sure you all have a plan to be there if you're trying to be there, and get connected to other environmental organizing if you so desire. So Timothy, I've introduced you, and we're ready for you to take it away.
Okay, great. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
We can.
Okay, great. I'm not sure I should be able to see anybody. Can I get a sense of like who's in the room, or just generally the size of group you have, or?
Sure, yeah.
Great.
So here in person, we've got 11 of us here in person watching you on the big screen, and then we've got looks like 5 people online tuning in from across Vermont to hear you talk.
Okay, great. I will just jump in. Again, I'm Timothy DenHerder-Thomas. I am here in Minnesota. I'm based in Minneapolis, and I've been doing a lot of energy democracy work over the last couple of years. I'm going to start the screen share and then switch over to my PowerPoint and just confirm to me if that works. Wow, that's complicated. I think we are here. Okay. Can you see the slideshow?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. I'm going to.
Yes.
Awesome. Great. Glad that the tech is working. So that's my intro slide. I want to just start just by briefly going through how our energy system works, and particularly on the electrical side. And this may be an overview for many of you, but just want to make sure we're all starting from the same page. This is a very simplified diagram of an electric grid. It's simplified because obviously all of your electric generating resources are not all in the same place. You have power plants and wind turbines and solar, and your power plants might be hydroelectric or natural gas, or I know you had a closed nuclear plant recently in Vermont. So a bunch of different power generating resources that are located all over the place. And then you have high voltage transmission lines connecting those to substations in communities. And there's various levels of substations indicated in these diagrams, which are basically reducing the voltage closer to a level that is distributed throughout neighborhoods. And then you have the distribution systems, these local power lines that are distributing that energy to homes and businesses. One of the key things to note here is that while it is a very complex grid, the flow of energy is pretty one-way. It is from utilities to energy users, and energy users in the regulatory environment are primarily seen as consumers, or even the term I have heard used is captive ratepayers, is how they often refer to us. So this is an energy system that is dominated by massive scale infrastructure and a one-way relationship in terms of how energy flows, and also a one-way relationship in the opposite direction in terms of how money flows from the users of energy to big companies that produce energy. I can talk way more about the technical details if need be, but I'm keeping it simple for now because there's only a little bit of time. So to zoom out, that's that system of grids, which we looked at briefly here, all of those high voltage transmission lines connecting us all. This is one big system. I've heard it described as the North American electric grid. It actually extends into Canada as well. I've heard it described as the largest machine that people have ever created. Essentially, every power plant, every substation, and every user is connected through this network of electric wires that is literally the size of a continent. And you have electricity traveling down that system at not quite the speed of light, but very close. This is also a very expensive system. So the cost of building a high voltage transmission line averages about $1 million per mile. If you look at this map, you can get a sense of how many miles of high voltage transmission lines we have across the country. This is hundreds of billions of dollars of investment that has been put in to building an energy system that works this way. Embedded in this are hundreds of power plants, each of which costs several hundred million to a couple of $1 billion apiece. So as you can imagine, this is not a business historically that lots of ordinary people have decided that, hey, I want to go start my own energy generating facility and sell energy in market. Because it's just too expensive and it requires Wall Street capital to even start playing the game. Or at least it did until we had renewable energy that is much more scalable and appropriate to the scale of energy use that we have in local communities. And that's driving a really rapid change in what's possible with the grid. And I believe it will drive a really huge change in how we do energy. But we should at least note that the business model and the regulatory model for how energy has been done is very much oriented towards this mass scale, multi-billion-dollar investment model, and hasn't really translated yet to energy democracy or ways of doing energy that are more locally based and community rooted. I wanted to provide really briefly a simplification of how utilities make money and how that relates to the money that we all pay, because I think that this is pretty important to understand and build off of as we move towards energy democracy. So this is generally true to some extent in all states, but this model is especially true in regulated states, which essentially means you have monopoly energy utilities and the rates are set by a state regulatory agency. That's the case in Minnesota, and I've done a little bit of research, and I'm pretty sure that's also the system that you're operating under in Vermont. In that system, you have a monopoly, so there is no competition. You know, all of the things that they say about the free market with competition and people being able to offer things, all that goes out the window because you only have one company that's providing basic energy services. And so you get this question, well, if you have a monopoly, what's to prevent them from charging whatever they want? And what states across the U.S. have come up with over time is a set of regulatory agencies that require utilities to follow a formula to decide what they're going to charge all of us for energy. And this is a dramatic simplification of the formula. But essentially what it boils down to is they get to charge us for all of their expenses. So all of the natural gas that they burn, all the coal that they burn, all of the employees that they pay, all of the technological costs for billing and administrative systems, all of those expenses that they have in their operations goes into this annual utility expense term and just gets passed on to all of us. But then there's all this stuff that they've built, these one-time investments in building power plants and transmission lines and substations and all this other infrastructure. And if you're on the heating side, natural gas pipelines and all of that type of thing. And so essentially what they're allowed to do is take the initial costs that they invested and have us pay them back over the span of time that's related to the lifespan of that infrastructure with a profit margin. So it depends state by state and utility to utility, but it's pretty common for that profit margin to be a 9 to 14% rate of return, meaning every year the utility shareholders, assuming everything pans out the way they're expecting, will be making 9 to 14% on their investment for building all of these power plants and other infrastructure, which helps explain why utilities are very interested in having things work the way that they've always worked, because they get quite a good return for their shareholders. And ultimately, at the end of the day, this price, the amount we pay on our energy bills, is that big long equation adding up all of their expenses and a little bit of the cost of all of their infrastructure each year with a profit margin, all divided by the amount of energy that we all use. So it's not quite that, because there's different rate classes for different types of customers and various adjustments to the formula. But in principle, this is what we're all paying for energy. So the thing I want to emphasize here is all of us, as we're paying our energy bills, we are essentially paying to finance the construction of power plants, which, as we all know, are leading causes in local health and environmental problems, as well as climate change and deep long-term threats to our stability as a society. And the utilities here don't really have an incentive to be efficient, because if there is a lower cost energy source, that doesn't actually improve their bottom line. What improves their bottom line is being able to build more infrastructure and get their state regulators to approve a higher profit margin on that infrastructure. So we have some very fundamental disincentives and problems here in our current energy system that prevent clean energy, even when it's affordable, from being the default option for these utilities. This is especially the case because, as we saw back here, they're used to thinking at a very large scale, and they don't want to deal with 1,000 different small projects that are each feeding small amounts of locally available energy. They want to do 10 or 12 big power plants that are easy for them to manage and finance in big, large chunks. And also, if you do it that way, no one else can participate because no one else is big enough. So that's the section of this that's really about where are we. And I wanted to quickly just note what it means and a local case study of what it means to be working on energy democracy. So this is a vision statement and a set of goals behind Community Power, which is a local coalition that I helped found and that I'm on the board of, that is focused on this vision. We want a clean, local, affordable, reliable, and equitable energy future. And we think that this is key both for addressing climate change, because right now the strategies that are conventionally used to address climate change are only accessible to middle and upper income people and people with high credit scores, who also tend to be white and not in communities that are facing long-term marginalization in terms of how investment and resource extraction happens in communities. We also see this as really important in terms of addressing the economic justice pieces of our energy system. And I think these goals that we've set for a Minnesota energy system here are together the types of things that you generally see in an energy democracy framework. It's looking at renewable energy and climate change. So, if we don't address these key sustainability issues, none of the rest of this matters. But at the same time, it's speaking directly to control of local wealth. So how do we ensure that our energy that we're using is also owned locally in our communities and owned by our communities? That low-income people who are currently spending 15 or 20 or sometimes even more % of their entire income paying for energy don't have to spend that much. That we're dramatically reducing our energy use so that these clean energy resources can serve our overall use much more efficiently. That there's access across all sorts of property ownership and income levels. A lot of what we focus on is ensuring that renters can participate in energy solutions. That we've really shifted who owns and who profits from the energy system. Because, right now, big corporations that are channeling wealth from our communities into the hands of shareholders and large investors are the folks who control profits from our energy system, even though it's considered a public good and something that is a monopoly, so we all have to participate in. And then some of these other things around resilience, both in a climate perspective and also to technological shift that's going on. I'm not going to focus too much on the lower half of this slide, but these are generally strategies that we use to exert change and create this type of energy system. The thing I want to emphasize here is that we have seen here in Minnesota, and I suspect you've seen very similar things in Vermont, and I've seen them in many other states as well. You have a policy establishment around clean energy that is, I think, takes it as a matter of pride to be very agnostic about the size and ownership and orientation of the way we solve this problem, as if whether or not it is accessible and benefiting everyone isn't important, both in for its own right and on its own basis, but also as a key ingredient of how do we get massive numbers of people and people across all ends of the political spectrum, the economic spectrum, culture and racial identity. How do we get everyone to participate? It has seemed really unfortunate to me that often when we talk about clean energy, a lot of larger environmental groups are perfectly happy for that to be done in the same centralized monopoly model as our dirty energy system, both because I think there's major economic justice reasons why that's a problem, but also because I don't think we're going to be able to build a movement that can and create clean energy in a way that is deeply accessible and available to everyone if we don't take an energy democracy approach. I wanted to highlight a couple of examples. This one is actually from Denmark. This is a very large-scale wind project. These are commercial-size wind turbines. I don't actually know the megawatt size, but I suspect each turbine is in the range of 2 megawatts or even more. And there's this whole big array of them. This is a project that is worth tens of millions of dollars, and there are projects that are technologically very similar to this going up, all across the Midwest here, and you're probably seeing similar things in the ridges and the Northeast. But the difference with this project and many of the projects that they've been doing in Denmark and Germany is that it's 2/3 cooperatively owned. So 2/3 of this wind project are owned by about 2,000 Danish citizens who have invested in the project and are generating returns from their participation in the project because they're actually generating and selling clean energy through this cooperative. The other third of the project is owned by the local utility who's partnering with these cooperative members as an economic development project that's creating jobs and building wealth in the community. This is standard practice in Denmark. It's standard practice in Germany. A majority of the renewable energy projects that are being developed in those countries are cooperatively and locally owned. I'm very pleased to be from the state in the U.S. that has the largest proportion of cooperative and locally owned clean energy in the country. However, the amount that we have is still very small in comparison to corporate-owned and monopoly-controlled renewable energy. And that's in large part because we haven't had a policy framework or a business framework here in the U.S. that has really encouraged or even really been aware of the value of this local economic development model in terms of how these projects are built. One of the things that you see both in Western Europe, but also here in Minnesota, and we've seen similar things in other states where there have been local ownership, is that the amount of local opposition to renewable energy when it is owned by and when the wealth is going to your neighbors and friends, the amount of opposition to it drops dramatically. And in fact, the vast majority of people come to see this as the new local business. It's not some big corporation coming in and taking your local resources and pulling more out of the community just the same way the utilities have always done. It's actually a way to channel millions of dollars back into the local economy. And it's kind of funny. A lot of the aesthetic and material concerns that people raise tend to be kind of strange minority opinions in areas that that have really seen renewable energy as a strategy for growing their local economy. And that's not to say that some of those issues aren't valid and meaningful, just that I think they are in a more appropriate scale or level of concern in relation to the actual impact of these types of developments. This is another model. This is downtown Minneapolis. This is a solar array that's on the top of the convention center here. It's about 600 kilowatts. This is not a community solar garden, but it is technologically very similar to what I'm currently working on a number of sites across Minnesota, where we're developing community solar. And this is a cooperatively owned model for many people in the state to sign up to get their energy from these solar panels, which are not located on their own home, but there's a state law that requires our utility, Xcel Energy, to give credits on the utility bill for energy produced by these solar projects. And as a cooperative, Cooperative Energy Futures, we're actually able to develop these projects in a way that people who want to sign up can do so at zero upfront cost, and the amount you pay per month is actually less than the amount you save on your bill. So we're actually offering, right now, we're developing 8 projects right now that will provide the full 25 years of power use for about 1,000 people in Minnesota. And unless they prefer to have an option where they buy up front, none of those people will have to pay anything on the front end. And from the first month that they participate, they're saving money on their energy bills. Additionally, because it's cooperatively owned, after all of the financing and upfront investment to build this system is paid off, the profits of the system are redistributed to the people who sign up as part of the cooperative. So we're channeling that wealth back into the community, and we're also leveling off people's energy costs so that they're no longer vulnerable to price spikes and the high cost of energy that are currently happening with natural gas heating and coal, natural gas, and nuclear electricity. So we're able to actually see real examples of what this looks like here in the US through the community solar garden model, which I think is also available in Vermont, but I'm not clear on the details of your program there. I wanted to, I'm getting kind of close to the end of my general orientation, but I wanted to just give a little bit of a picture of, in the long run, as we start to integrate community-owned wind and community solar and much deeper implementation of energy efficiency, what is the difference between that mass national corporate controlled grid and the type of grid we'd like to see in the future. And this is a concept diagram of what a smart grid looks like, and I assume that some folks in the room are generally familiar with the approach. But essentially the idea is instead of that one-way relationship where you have all of your energy coming from these big power plants and just being distributed to neighborhoods, and then the neighborhoods and energy users are just paying off the utility company, here you have a many-to-many relationship where energy is being generated through solar on homes and businesses and through wind projects in the community. And there's storage and other, like battery or compressed air or hydroelectric storage systems that are saving energy when it's being generated by the clean energy sources and delivering it when it's needed, that are dispersed throughout the community and can be owned either individually by individual households or businesses, or can be owned cooperatively and as a community, and have a grid that is highly automated and allows them to deliver energy to each other, really as an energy neighborhood. So I like, if it's a little hard to wrap your head around, you can think of this as an analogous shift from our current energy system is like the TV and newspaper mass media, which is how everyone got their information 20 years ago. Which has now shifted to, those big actors still exist, but they're a much smaller player in the ecosystem as compared to all of the, social media, peer-to-peer, internet-based. Many people can participate in creating and using in a platform. You can think of that as an analogy on the information side that is very similar to what I think energy democracy helps us move towards. With these new distributed local clean energy technologies in terms of our energy system. So I'm going to stop there, and I hope this has provided a little bit of an intro to where we are, where we could be, and what are some of the examples of what it looks like to do that work. And I'm really happy to take questions and discuss further. The one thing I would really say that I haven't stressed so much is that I think from a movement building perspective, from movement building perspective, approaching climate change and our energy issues from a perspective of energy democracy, it moves us much more into an anti-monopoly and anti-corporate control lens to how we think about climate change than kind of what I've seen as a traditional approach, which is very all about the technology and not very much about how it actually affects people and how it influences the balance of wealth and power in our society. And I think we have to understand and look at climate change itself as a problem with the balance of power and control in our society and what gets valued in that balance. And energy democracy is in part, I think, a much more equitable and accessible way to create mass access to clean energy. And it is also fundamentally about changing that balance of power. And I think that it's really hard. It's hard work, but I have also seen efforts that don't look at those questions about political and economic power to end up with large-scale renewable energy systems that are also highly dependent on giant natural gas power plants as backup, which is not helping either our economic justice goals or our goals of addressing climate change. So I am going to stop the screen share here and go back on video, and I'm happy to take questions and be part of the rest of our discussion.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Timothy. That was really awesome. Let me see. Does anyone right here have questions? So I was wondering, Austin, would you want to give a brief context of your understanding of Vermont's utility system and see how that changes any of the kind of context for us?
Yeah, so great presentation. Really awesome work you're doing. I think, there's some things that, that's kind of what your presentation was, very much basic level utility, and like that's kind of like the building block every state starts from. So I guess some context on Vermont that makes Vermont slightly different. First and foremost is that we have a 90 by 2050 goal, which, although we think it's kind of like standard practice, isn't necessarily held by every state. So that's kind of driving every energy decision that we have from now to 90 by 2050.
Just so I'm clear, is that a goal or is it a mandate?
It's a goal, but we do have things in statute that then do drive towards that goal. So the most relevant to that would be the renewable portfolio standard that we have, that basically is telling utilities that they need to own a certain percent of their portfolio as renewable. And then additionally to that, there's a renewable energy standard, which is basically telling utilities that they need to displace fossil fuels at a certain amount. The renewable energy standards, for example, is the reason why we just saw the new electric bus that Burlington Electric Department did. They did that to fulfill part of the renewable energy standard. So those are like two really big. This is something that makes a very Vermont's utility, landscape, if you will, kind of different, because when the Public Service Board goes to deal with utilities and test rates, they have a kind of multiple mandate.
So it just for your context, I don't know the percentages or the level of teeth in your requirements in Vermont, but I don't necessarily see that as a very significant difference, because we and many other states, but Minnesota also has a very strong renewable energy and also energy efficiency standard. So our largest utility is required to achieve 30% renewable electricity by 2020, and we're on track to meet that goal. And also we have an 80 by 50 climate goal. So there are similar requirements. They're all going to be different state to state, but there are similar requirements here and in many other states. And I think looking at how utilities have gone about implementing them and whether that implementation is, number one, in the best interest of people who are purchasing energy, whether it is actually the least cost way to go about doing clean energy for the users, not for the utility investors, and also how is that translated in terms of the wealth generation and local control. But please keep going if there was more context you wanted to share.
Oh yeah, what I was going to say was also another context for folks is last year the legislature passed Act 174, which basically is about community energy planning. So up until last year, what we really had was we had a comprehensive energy plan guiding much of what was being done at the state level to get to our 90 by 2050 goals. And then with this, what we basically see is we see the top level goals coming from the state, 90% renewable by 2050. And then at the community level, we have individuals working in their town energy planning that basically looks at how does our community contribute to this. And in that, they're basically zoning areas for renewables or not for renewables. And they're not necessarily necessarily able to say, we're not going to do it. They need to give explanations of where and why they want specific renewables in different places. And I think, that's a really great way to engage with folks who, for example, aren't necessarily happy with different installations like wind and solar. Be able to have some input as to where those are going, where those areas are. And that's something that, if you want to talk about, I think that's a great step towards energy democracy right there, as communities can, these individuals who want to participate in this planning process can. I think that one major obstacle to it that we've seen is this was something that, the individuals in the current administration were pushing for. And then when it came time for them to actually propose their budget this year, the funding that's supposed to be attached to help communities do this never made it into the budget. So it was, while they're pushing for, election to get elected, they're all in favor of this. And once they got elected, we've seen the funding fall short, which is really unfortunate because this was originally supposed to be a 3-year rollout, be $300,000, and it hasn't gotten that money. So I guess that's another thing. And then, I think that sometimes we kind of have another obstacle to community is our net metering program, which is fantastic, but I think that there's things that have happened in it which were well-intended that might now also have negative effects. One such example would be net metering regulations that put lower rates or try to phase out solar development in green fields, like areas that are not necessarily, that are just open fields that could be used for potentially agriculture. Those are great, but those are also the areas that you need for community solar if you're going to have a large enough array that individuals can buy into it. And then also with, with wind, for example, if you want community wind, it has to be a larger project, and larger projects tend to get pushback. So it would be great to see community wind. I think a lot of installers in the state would love to see that, but there's kind of one of those, well, if you go that route, then there's more pushback. But if you go that route, there's less pushback. So where's the tipping point on that? I think is an issue.
We're not at a point in Vermont yet of letting people own energy the same way that Timothy's talking about.
Oh no, but I'm saying there are
to me.
Well, there are solar cooperatives in the state, and I think that what I'm saying is there really isn't the potential for wind cooperatives in the state because we're not doing it at the scale that you would need to do a wind cooperative.
Well, we have a couple more minutes. Let's see if anyone have questions, whether here in Burlington or online. You can type in your little message box and we can read your question out loud for everyone. Does anyone here have a question? Awesome. Speak loudly for the people on the computer.
Tim, when you're getting a community array together, what's the route you take exactly? Do you do a nonprofit route? Do you organize in a community? How big of a community does this really need to be?
Sorry, could you say the last bit again? It's a little hard to hear.
So when you're organizing a community array, it's pretty much two questions. How big does this community have to be? Does it have to be very centrally geographically located? And also, how are you doing this? Is this a nonprofit approach? Are you going through a solar company of itself?
Sure. So our rules for community solar gardens here in Minnesota say that the subscribers, meaning the people participating, have to be in the same utility. So right now, because the only utility that's required to do this is Xcel Energy, we're only serving Xcel Energy customers, but Xcel serves 55% of the customers in the state and pretty much everyone in the core cities. So it's a pretty big area. So you have to be the same utility and you have to be in the same or adjacent county, which is actually a pretty big area. Oh, sorry, you want me to repeat the question? So the question was, number one, how centrally located or large does the community have to be, and then are we developing it through a nonprofit or what model? So I was addressing the first of those. In terms of the cost effectiveness, the rates in Minnesota are changing. We've historically found that a solar system has to be at least 200 to 250 kilowatts to be viable. That's about a 30,000 square foot roof. We have done quite a few of these on commercial roofs, but we are doing some ground mounts as well. And then we also do some ground mounts in the 1 megawatt range, which is about 5 acres. And actually, we do have some rooftops that are big enough for that too, which I'm not sure is as common in Vermont. And then in terms of the ownership model, so that piece of my work is, I'm as Elise mentioned, I'm general manager of Cooperative Energy Futures. Cooperative Energy Futures is a member-owned co-op, so we're a cooperative business. And we develop solar gardens. We don't actually do the installation ourselves. We essentially put out RFPs to solar installers that we work with and get competitive bids to actually do the installation. But we do the financing, subscriber recruitment, operations and maintenance, and all of the Excel interconnection process to connect these systems to the grid and work with the utility.
Awesome. All right, I guess we probably have time for like one, maybe two more questions. We have time probably for one, maybe two more questions to those on the computer. This is your time. Type your question, get it answered. We'll also can keep having this conversation among ourselves here in Vermont, but want to give people on the computer a chance to speak up.
Yes, one.
Sure. Go for it. Just come in.
Timothy, I really like your talk about getting marginalized people involved in the process. Practically, what does that look like? How does somebody who's part of a marginalized community take time out of their life to get involved in making a community decision making a community decision?
Sure. You know, I think both for marginalized communities, but also really for any community, it's important to keep in mind that different people are going to participate at different levels and with different intensities. So like some of the participation is simply like there's a solar garden happening in your community that's been organized by other people. Do you want to sign up and get 5% off your bill? That's, you know, it's still a little bit of a process, but it's a decision where there's a very immediate and tangible self-interest. And so that's in many ways the most accessible way. But what we find is that, you know, even in communities that are struggling financially, there's a real passion and interest for involvement and taking leadership around solutions. And the real barrier is a combination of this type of work is so unfamiliar, you know, not just to low income folks, but honestly to most people, that even the idea that one could be part of a local cooperative business that is developing clean energy is very unfamiliar. And the tools and the resources to get started are not very accessible. So a big piece of what we do is we convene local organizations, including places of worship, neighborhood organizations, local organizations. For example, we have a partnership with this organization, North Country Cooperative Foundation, that helps members of manufactured housing parks form cooperatives to buy out the land under their homes. They're essentially creating housing stability for people in manufactured housing parks. Organizations like that have a direct relationship and direct channel to low-income communities act as sort of the conveners and hosts of these conversations, so that there's an existing trusted source and an existing space, whether it's those types of organizations or places of worship or those other groups that I mentioned, to bring people together and invite folks to participate. And as with any community, you know, you're going to get a few people who want to dive all in and really get super involved. You're going to have a larger but still small number of people who want to have some discussions and give some input. And then you're going to have a very large number of people who want to hear about it and maybe want to jump in but don't want to do a lot of work. And that's totally fine. That's how work happens in a community.
Are we getting any questions from the typing folks? No typing questions. Do you want to?
Yeah. So if you have like a rooftop solar array, like you gave an example of, that can feed like 1,000 people. So if you have communities that consist of, tens of thousands of people, who gets first dibs? Like, how does that work? Is it just a slow rollout? How does that work?
Yeah, so just first as a point of clarity, the 1,000 households I mentioned is the total of 8 different systems we're working on, which is a combination of rooftops and ground mount. But to answer the question, it's really a first come, first serve, or kind of within a targeted community where we're doing outreach, first come, first serve. And we don't have capacity to serve everyone all at once. And I think one of the challenges with energy democracy is just how much work there is to do. And it's exciting because it's great work, and it's work that is generates its own resources and creates local jobs, but it is a lot of work, and we're trying to swallow the ocean here. So I'd say our work in Minnesota as an example of cooperatively owned community solar is currently one of the larger cooperatively owned community solar projects in the country. And I find that pretty depressing, actually, because I know how small we are. And I think really the promise here with energy democracy is that we get more and more communities thinking the same way, so that as we scale up, and we're increasing our order of operations by, it feels like an order of magnitude every year nearly. But how do we help other communities start getting on that growth curve and doing the same thing? And this strategy is not a, you do 5% this year and 5% next year and 5% the year after. This is you do 1/100% this year and 1/10% next year and 1% the year after that and 10% the year after. And it's gonna take a lot of crawling before we walk and walking before we run before this can become a dominant energy strategy here in the US. But it has been demonstrated as a very effective strategy for how we run our energy system in other parts of the world.
And it sounds like we've got one more question that came in through the chat box. I don't know if you see it, Timothy.
Yep.
Great. Can you read it out for us?
Sure. So question from John. In Vermont and in Ontario, we've seen renewable energy developers push through and lobby to maintain restrictions on the amount of say towns and citizens have on the siting and scale of industrial wind and solar development. And there's so much profit to be made both by tax subsidies and the direct sale of renewable energy that these profits are being used to underwrite local and nationally affiliated environmental groups to garner their support and advocacy of their projects, oftentimes working with the developers against the communities that these projects should be sited in. Is this an issue in Minnesota, and is the level of discord the same tenor as we are seeing here in Vermont, which is very high? I would say it is not, there definitely is that presence, and I would say a lot of national environmental groups have not been very sensitive to or thoughtful about the local impact and also the need for local benefit. And have been, as I kind of mentioned, totally fine to fuel big clean energy companies. But I wouldn't say that has been a major dynamic in our situation here in Minnesota. And I think part of that is because we've had a very strong history of locally owned and community owned wind. And there is a risk of that as we just now starting to see a boom in solar. And that is part of the positioning and role of cooperative energy futures, is trying to demonstrate a very powerful alternative. Since there's sort of a slowly growing community backlash against corporate renewable energy as we're seeing this boom in renewable energy development here in Minnesota. I guess what I'm saying is I think the more you can demonstrate widespread, scalable, and significant models for community benefit and community ownership, number one, you can build a lot of interest in the community in those models as opposed to absentee corporate models. which changes the base of like just economic demand for those projects versus community-based projects. And it also creates a stronger base of community groups that can insist, locally politically and statewide politically, and ultimately someday federally politically, not against renewable energy development in our communities, but for renewable energy development in our communities that's designed by and for the people who use it. So I think that that's a key question, and I really think the acceleration of cooperative and community-based strategies that actually work is at the centerpiece for unraveling that problem.
Awesome. Well, I think that's a really great place to end the webinar portion of our evening, because we're going to have a little wrap-up conversation here in Burlington. But I want to thank you, Timothy, so much for your time and your work today. And big thank you to everyone who joined us via the interwebs and phones and whatever devices you're using out there, you silly kids. Yeah, thanks so much, Timothy.
Okay, thank you. I wish you luck in all your work in Vermont.
Same to you out in Minnesota.
Bye.
All right, y'all. So we told you we'd get you out of here by 8.